Today, our guest is Dr. Mike T. Nelson, who's the owner and chief Uber nerd at Extreme Human Performance LLC. Mike has spent 18 years of his life learning how the human body works, specifically focusing on how to properly condition it to burn fat and become stronger, more flexible, and healthier. He has a PhD in exercise physiology, a BA in natural science, and an MS in biomechanics. He's an adjunct professor and a member of the American College of Sports Medicine. He's been called in to share his techniques with top government agencies. The techniques he's developed and the results Mike gets for his clients have been featured in international magazines and scientific publications and on websites across the globe. Mike, welcome to the Anti-Aging Hacks podcast.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, too.
Absolutely. And I've seen you a few times, and you just have such a wealth of knowledge. First of all, how did you get into exercise and fitness?
Yeah, probably like most most guys, I started doing, I'd say, formal weight training when I started my first year of college. So I was same height I am now. I've been the same height since probably about 8th grade. So I'm about 6'3". I was very much a eel-shaped rake at 156 pounds. Even after I went through, the main part of puberty and all that kind of stuff. So I took a class and did my undergrad on weight training. I'm like, oh, this is going to be great. I'm finally going to learn like what to do. And the guy was I think he's a cross country coach. Comes in the first day. He's like, all right, we're going to show you how to lift weights and stuff. And he's kind of very brash. And he's looking around everyone. He goes, some of you need to lose weight. And he points at me and he goes, holy shit, some of you need to gain weight. And I'm like, yeah, that's kind of why I'm here. And then sadly, he gave us the tour of the gym the next day, and then he disappeared and just left us with the TA who just took attendance. So it wasn't really helpful at all.
Yeah.
But just started doing everything wrong, basically. And at the same time, I was super interested in biology, and I took anatomy and physiology just for extra credit. Basically, I didn't need it for my degree per se. And it was nice at the college at St. Scholastica in Duluth, Minnesota. Anyone who took undergrad anatomy and physiology actually got to use cadavers, which was super, super rare, and even still is pretty rare to this day. Mm-hmm. And they got new cadavers every quarter. So they actually had cadavers that were prosected specifically for an undergraduate level of anatomy and physiology. So I was very fortunate that I got to take that whole series and just kind of get more, I guess, as close to real life exposure as you can. And just, from there just started doing more stuff in exercise phys. When I did my master's, I literally took exercise phys just for fun. I had to appeal to the professor to get in, and he looks at me and he goes, but you're not an exercise phys major. This is like a 400 level class. And I'm like, well, I don't want any credit for it. I don't even need any credit. He's like, well, actually you can't have any more credit because you're maxed out. And I'm like, oh. He's like, well, what if you just happen to show up at the same time class is taught every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and I just don't say anything? I'm like, perfect.
Wow. That's amazing. So you just wanted to learn. You didn't need the credit hours. You just wanted to learn the science behind it.
Yeah, and I didn't need any of the credits. I just thought, I'm like, well, because to my brain, being more of the engineering side, it's like, well, exercise physiology, that's the outcome of all the pathology, the anatomy and physiology, like all the undergraduate stuff, because to me, that was the application. And, when you get into class, depending on who the professor and how it's taught, a lot of times you're just taught that, no, exercise is just another stressor. We just use exercise to poke stuff around in the body. A lot of times it's not necessarily taught from a performance standpoint. Because in my brain, I thought, this is going to be about performance. How do you get bigger? How do you get stronger? All these things. And it was more or less just anatomy and physiology in motion, which still useful, but I always kind of like more the practical side too.
Yeah. So you were the skinny guy that wanted to learn how to get bigger, and you thought you'd get some benefit from this class. But did you or didn't you?
No, not really. It's one of those weird things where I kept thinking like, the next class I take, that's going to tell me what's going on. And, like all guys, you start reading all the, fitness magazines and stuff, and you start doing weird routines. And I remember one of the guys working at the gym during my undergrad, like pulls me aside. He's like, hey, you've been like coming here, like, every 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, but you do the same thing every day. And I'm like, oh, is that bad? He's like, yeah, you probably want to change it up a little bit. I'm like, oh, okay. Like stuff that we think is like just so incredibly basic, but people tend to be creatures of habit. And I was basically just doing an A/B split. So it was actually every other day. But it was more, it wasn't squats, wasn't deadlifts, try not to get killed by the bench press. It was, kind of more of the isolation type stuff that, yeah, they're not bad exercises, but as a bang for your buck exercise, probably not the place to start with a preacher curl.
Yep. So how did you get into heart rate variability and metabolic flexibility?
Yeah, so I did my undergrad and then I did 2 years post-grad. Did my master's stuff, which took another 2.5 years. So after I got done, I did about 7.5 years of college, just full-time all the way through. I'm like, screw this stuff. I'm never going back to school again. Started working for a medical device company in the cardiology space. And so that was super interesting. And I met a guy there and he's like, well, because I was thinking about getting a master's in exercise phys at the time. And he's like, well, what are you going to do with another master's? He's like, you should just get a PhD and maybe you should do something you're related to now. So I started a PhD in biomedical engineering. I did that for almost 4 years full time. And then I dropped out right as I completed almost literally all the classwork. Because I spent all my free time going to exercise physiology conferences. And I didn't enjoy math. I was not a good math student, especially being an engineer. That's not a good sign. And I took a class on MRIs, and the guy just starts writing like symbols on the board, like from day one. And I poked the guy next to me, and these are all like PhD students in physics and electrical engineering. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, do you know what he's even writing up there? And this guy's a PhD in math, and he goes, no. And he's just like frantically scribbling everything down. And I'm like, I think I'm going to opt out of here. So I got tired of doing math. I went over to the exercise physiology department, which that means a different department. I have to start over from ground zero. I get there the first day. An advisor walks in. He goes, hey, we got 2 new projects. One's on heart rate variability and one's on metabolic flexibility. And they both involve a lot of math. I'm like thinking, no, you're kidding me. Right. And he looks around the table and he points at me sitting in the back. He's like, you, math boy, whatever your name is, like, these are your projects now. And I was like, oh. So yeah, basically that's how I started it. And that was about 12 years ago now.
Wow. So interesting that you tried to run away from math and then you had to embrace the math in the new field that you were entering.
Yeah, which luckily it wasn't as bad as what I was doing before. So it was fine. And, most people do, exercise phys, unless you're doing some route in biomechanics or something like that, depending on what you're doing. Math isn't just something you take a lot of, credits in. So most people don't have a background in that per se.
Okay. I want to talk to you a lot, Mike, because you're an expert about exercise and nutrition. But first, I want to touch on metabolic flexibility. It sounds like a very sciencey term, but what does it really mean, simply?
Yeah, so in English, it means that if we kind of narrow down the 2 fuels that your body primarily uses are going to be fats and carbohydrates. Those also turn out to be macronutrients too. And everyone in fitness is like, no, you have to use only fat. And then, no, you have to use carbohydrates. There's this kind of debate back and forth all the time. Mm-hmm. But metabolic flexibility is, okay, well, how do you use both fats and carbohydrates as a fuel source, depending on what you're actually doing at that time? And then how do you switch back and forth between the two? Right. So it's kind of respecting the more dynamic nature of the body. So it's not necessarily saying, fats are better, carbs are better. You actually want to probably use both. Just depends on what you are doing. And then how fast can you transition back and forth between them?
What are the benefits for the listeners of being more flexible metabolically to use carbs or fat as needed?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of an oversimplification, but it's not too far off. I would say that it allows you to get a better body composition and a relatively high level of performance. This again, assuming you're not going to be an elite athlete or something like that, or a special case, most people want to know, okay, well, kind of how poorly can I eat and still perform and look well, right? And I probably don't want my health to go to crap either. Yeah. Right? They don't really ever come out and say that, but for most people, that's kind of where they're trying to walk. So it's allowing you to still use fat as a fuel, which again could be the fat that you consumed in a meal, could be body fat depending on the conditions, But no one really wants to go to the gym and just watch all their weights and the performance that they're doing either feel harder or actually start to go in reverse or not make any progress. So it's
Mhm.
not very motivating, even if that's not your main number one goal. So using carbohydrates, which we'll get into for performance, is very beneficial, especially for higher intensity, weight training, intervals, things of that nature. So metabolic flexibility kind of allows you to ride that middle ground of both kind of body composition and performance. And I would actually argue that it's also a very good marker for health. So if we want a marker that we want to do those things, but we don't want to destroy our health in the process, to me, and like obviously I'm biased, that metabolic flexibility kind of sums up all three of those together.
Awesome. So you mentioned body performance, or sorry, performance as body composition. Both are very important, especially for listeners of this podcast, because
Sure.
as we get past 30 or 35, you stop trying to be the elite athlete or playing college soccer or running triathlons, and you just want to kind of like be the best you can be. For the most part, there's still the uber athletes out there.
Sure.
So I think the listeners of this podcast would be interested very much in how do you get the best body composition? How do you perform at your best? And so we'll get into that. But first, maybe let's talk about how do you use fats as a fuel, carbs as a fuel, and how do you transition from one to the other? How does that work?
Yeah. So the fancy term for that is from Brooks and Mercer back in the 1990s, which they called the crossover effect, which all it means is that in a very healthy individual, doesn't have any pathologies, doesn't have any issues, if they're just doing a low intensity fasted exercise, so overnight fast, haven't consumed any meal beforehand, if it's low intensity, they're going to use a very high percentage of fat as the main fuel source. As the intensity of the exercise increases, then they're going to use a higher and higher percentage of carbohydrates to fuel that. So if I put you on a rower and said, hey man, let's do a 500-meter row, a very short row, as hard as you can, maybe it takes a minute and a half, 2 minutes, somewhere around there, we actually want a high percentage of that to come from carbohydrates because that's going to allow us more speed and power.
Mm-hmm.
However, if it was a 5K maybe, and it's not super competitive or very long duration, purposely lower intensity, we actually want more of a percentage of that to come from fat, in my opinion. Now, the body's a little tricky where it can use carbohydrates even at a lower intensity. So some of that can get kind of wired a little bit differently. But because it's a low intensity, there's no need to use a high amount of carbohydrates. So the lower intensity, primarily more with fat, higher intensity, primarily more with carbohydrates.
Is that because, and this might be a dumb question, but is that because the fats take more time to release energy?
Yeah. So to me, like all this weird nonsense about like what is the best fuel drives me just like batshit crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Because the follow-up question then has to be the best fuel to do what?
Yes.
Right. So a lot of times people think, okay, all right, running a marathon, very long distance.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's got to be 100% use of fat. I'm like, well, what is your goal? If your goal is, I want to get better body composition, I like running, I've always wanted to complete a marathon is on my list of things to do. Yeah, I would argue probably using a higher percentage of fat is, for that case, going to be a benefit. Now, if you said, I am an elite marathon runner and I'm going to be in the Olympics, or like Nike was trying to do with breaking the 2-hour barrier, those people took a ton of carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
They did a study in half marathon, pretty high level athletes, where they actually blocked their ability to use fat. So they did not allow them access to fat at all. They ran almost entirely on carbohydrates, did not affect their times at all. So for an elite athlete, even something that's very long can be very much fueled by carbohydrates. But you're correct that fat has the advantage of, one, most people, even a lean athlete, has a lot of fat that can be used for energy, way more than you'd ever burn in like multiple marathons. So the amount of energy is plentiful. You already have it on your body. You're already carrying it around. The downside is that it takes longer to get that energy out. So you do get more ATP, right? So the currency of the body for 1 mole or a set amount of fat, then you do carbohydrates. So you get a lot more energy. The downside is it takes longer. So as you scale up that intensity, your body needs energy much, much, much faster. the rate at which you have to replete that ATP has to be higher to keep up with the amount of work that's being done, especially for speed and power.
Yeah.
And that's where fat as a fuel kind of falls off because it just can't keep up to that same rate that carbohydrates can.
Awesome. So if you plan your workouts correctly, then you can start to utilize fat for the days where you're not working high intensity. Therefore, you could burn some of your body fat just by working out.
Yeah, so I'm actually a fan of kind of old school fasted cardio, although I get a lot of hate mail about that too. There's only really been one or two actually randomized controlled trials that have looked at it for body comp reasons, and we can talk about that later if you want. But for most people, what I do is like a rough setup of like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, some type of higher intensity work, some type of probably weight training, something of that nature. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, especially for someone who's new, I'll just start them out on like old school kind of long duration cardio, right? So you can use the Maffetone equation of your 180 minus your age. So instead of the Carvonian, which is 220 minus your age, take 180 minus your age. So if you're 40, that's going to be a max heart rate of 140. Now this is going to be for low intensity submax work. That'll get you approximate ballpark of trying to make sure it stays at a lower intensity. And then my bias is to do that fasted if you can. So if you are able to do it first thing in the morning, I think that's probably going to be a little bit better. If you can't, it's not like the end of the world. I mean, getting the work in is by far and away the biggest thing to do. But my preference is if you can do it in the morning or just, not consume as many carbohydrates possibly before. We will see as a percentage of the fuel used in most people, fat will be a little bit higher percentage of the fuel that's actually being burned. So on those high intensity days, you're increasing the use of carbs. The lower intensity day, you're increasing the use of fat.
Okay. How do you measure your heart rate on the lower intensity days? Is that an easy thing to do?
Yeah, I just do old school. I think I have one still here, like just the little polar heart rate straps. Put that on. You can run it to your watch. Like I have a Garmin, but you can usually set the watch to actually pull from the heart rate strap. The optical on them on high heart rates are not real good. If you're using a rower or some type of equipment, it'll usually be you can pair it to the equipment there also, or you can get an app for your phone. You can look at it that way too.
Okay. So what are some examples of lower intensity exercise? You mentioned rowing. Would that be jogging as well? Running?
Yeah, so let's consider kind of classic cardio. So something where you can elicit it's a VO2 max. So the highest amount of work you can do while still staying aerobically, meaning using oxygen as the main thing to burn fuel. You're going to look at rowing, cross-country skiing, not so much indoor stuff, biking, running, and VersaClimber. Those are probably about the only ones. If you're an elite swimmer, maybe, but most people, their technique is like just too limiting on that.
Okay. Some of these machines at the gym, the Stairmaster or some of the treadmills have those built-in sensors. Do those work for heart rate?
They're okay. The ones that are built in where you have to like touch the handrails and all that stuff, they're pretty horrible. I don't trust those very much at all. Okay. They can be okay, but they're really variable. Most of the literature on most of the machine accuracy in most gyms is pretty pitiful. Like the number of calories you burned, all that stuff, it's just as an absolute number, it's not super accurate.
Okay. And how long would you do the slow intensity exercise for typically?
I have people just start out wherever they're used to. If you haven't done it before, 10 minutes is maybe an okay place to start. 20 minutes if they're, relatively in shape, I think you can get pretty far doing that. And if you're really trying to push the envelope, you may be doing 30, 40, 50, 60 minutes. It just depends on where you're at and what you need. If you have access to it, like I have a rower in my garage. So I usually go out most mornings and I'll just do low intensity work for just 6 to 10 minutes. I'll try to do it every day if I can, in addition to walking and exercise and everything else. Again, that's not a lot, but it does kind of add up over time. If you're using a rower, do a 5K a couple times a week. You're probably going to be, pretty good for, I'd say, average, health and kind of helping with body comp. The other part too is that what I've noticed in most people, more of that lower intensity work, usually doesn't seem to spike their appetite much either. If you start getting into higher intensity work, some people will feel very nauseous, not very hungry for a while, and then like super hungry.
Mm-hmm.
So I find it's much more variable. I find kind of that lower intensity work doesn't seem to increase people's appetite as much either.
Okay, let's touch on the higher intensity that you talked about. What are some typical exercises that you would do? Is strength, hardcore strength training part of that? What else?
Yeah, so I like strength training. Again, doesn't necessarily mean your heart rate is super high. If you're doing low reps, your heart rate may not spike up. If you're doing 5x5 on squats and really pushing it, yeah, your heart rate may get pretty high. It's kind of a byproduct of it. For interval type work, the bike is good. I like that. I'm kind of partial to the rower. I just find for most people, they can do a high amount of output and don't have a lot of joint stress. If they're a good sprinter and their mechanics of running are fine, I think sprinting can be good.
Mm-hmm.
But based on most people's gait pattern, having them go sprint at a high percentage makes me extremely nervous.
What are we talking? 40-yard dashes and then like a minute or two break?
Yeah, so I like using a time interval for the most part. So if people haven't done it before, even just all out for 10 seconds can be a fair amount, especially people new to running.
Mm-hmm.
If they're on a rower, I'll have them do 20 or 30-second intervals. And then I'll have them rest with starting out with what's called complete rest. Meaning, the nice part about a rower or even a bike, if you've got a assault bike, you have a display. They'll tell you exactly what you did because it'll measure that power output and how many watts you're generating.
Mm-hmm.
So I like people to rest as complete, so their heart rate will come all the way back down or pretty close to it. And then I want them to repeat that quality of work again, a bare minimum of at least 90% of what they did before. So I like doing it based on performance. And then over time, maybe you get up to 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 intervals. And it's taking you on average, let's say 45 seconds, maybe a minute of rest between each one.
Mm-hmm.
Now, could you do the same thing and can we compress it? So if you were taking 60 seconds between it, can you do that now and do 45 seconds of rest? Can you do 30 seconds of rest? But I don't want to see the quality of work dropping because you're training the body to repeat that high level stimulus again. Or if you're looking at running, it's called RSA, repeated sprintability. Most people do the inverse of that. They hop on whatever machine, they go as hard as they can. They're like, man, that really sucked. Oh, I got to do it again.
Mm-hmm.
And if you watch their performance, it's just, by the last time they do their fourth interval, it's like 50% of what their first one was.
Oh, wow. I remember I played soccer in college in my whole life. So we would do these sprints as part of the soccer. And even then, when I turned 30 and later, I was doing some of these sprints because it helps boost your metabolism. There's all these studies about growth and release of testosterone and helping growth hormone and all that. So obviously I was trying to get the anabolic benefits while also boosting my metabolism 2 or 3 times a week. So this is exactly in line with what you're saying. Now, I want to get into some use cases, Mike, since you talked about your template or how you would do this. Let's talk about some use cases. So most people want a good body composition. They want to lose the fat around their waist. They want to have a leaner muscle mass, but for guys, they want broad shoulders. For women, they might just want a lean body all the way around. So let's say that somebody has all the muscle they need. Let's talk about fat for now. All the muscle they need, and they just want to lose 5 to 10 pounds of fat. How would they maintain their muscle and lose the fat? So we can talk strategies and some tips you might give us.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing is they're going to have to be in some type of caloric deficit. However they do that, highly different ways to do it. Most of my clients, especially if health is kind of a parameter, I'll have them do the same template I just outlined, but on that Tuesday, I may have them do a longer period of fasting. So I'll take them for maybe 6 to 8 weeks and eventually have them do a 19 to 24 hour fast on that day. Mm-hmm. Reason for that is on that day, you're pushing insulin super low. So you are pushing the body to use more fat as a fuel. It's a pretty easy way if you take your time to get into it to just cut out basically a whole day's worth of calories. So you're automatically going to be in a caloric deficit because of that. And I found that just in practice, I started doing with clients almost 10 years ago, that a day of fasting was easier than a very, very low caloric day. Now, again, this will all be based on what are their preferences. I find most people, if I say, okay, every day you're going to have to eat a little bit less, or kind of, kind of going to be a little hungry,
Mm-hmm.
or, one day we're just going to, lop out a whole day's worth of calories. Yeah, you're going to be hungry, but if we do it right, most people will feel okay. And the other days, you're not going to go crazy eating everything in sight, but you're probably not going to be super hungry unless you're trying to get, just really lean.
Mm-hmm.
Most people will choose the latter approach. Just from a compliance standpoint, I was actually kind of shocked that it was actually easier. Because my hypothesis then was, oh, it's going to be horrible. No one's going to want to do it. It's going to be a freaking disaster. And I think something about just the simplicity of it is pretty simple. Like, don't eat anything with calories that day. Oh, okay, that's pretty simple.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that'd be kind of my basis of doing that. And then with performance in the gym, I would still want them to monitor that somehow. It's going to be just simply the weight lifted, number of reps, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to make sure that doesn't plummet too much, because that's going to be a pretty good indicator of them keeping most of their muscle and strength.
Mm-hmm. So on the fasted day where you're not eating for 19 to 24 hours, you don't lose the muscle is what you're saying. You'll drop more fat.
I haven't seen that. I mean, there's not any study that's looked at that directly. I mean, there's all sorts of different studies on, 16-8, 1 day fasting, 2 days of fasting. But, in the population we're talking about, I haven't seen a direct study on that.
Mm-hmm.
From talking to a bunch of protein experts, that my bias is you're definitely not building any protein on that day because you don't have anything coming in. You don't have a stimulus, but you're not really losing anything either. I mean, you're going to have a little bit of higher level of breakdown, but in the end, I don't think it's going to make a massive difference to most people. And I mean, I've used that approach with just tons of clients over the last 10 years. And I mean, I haven't seen any just massive muscle loss or huge performance drop or anything like that.
Sure. Now, how much protein on the days that you're eating for losing 5 or 10 pounds of weight, fat, how much protein should you be eating every day?
I would set a minimum of around 0.7 grams per pound of body weight. So if you're a 200-pound person, it's about 140 grams per day. Now, by bodybuilding standards, that's not super high. You can get up to as high as, 1 gram per pound. And maybe if you're really, really nervous about trying to exact every little ounce possible and you're a natural competitor, that might be useful. Or if your appetite gets super high and you want something to help control it. But most of the long-term studies that we've seen, there's about 5 of them so far. Eric Helms, Stu Phillips, and those guys did another meta-analysis last year, and they came out to right around the same number too. So it's higher, obviously the higher than the RDA by quite a bit, but it's not astronomically high either.
Yeah. And for longevity and anti-aging, you want to keep the protein long-term around that level or low. You don't want too much, as the bodybuilders recommend, because it boosts insulin and that does downstream damages in IGF-1 to your body, which we can talk about in a little bit. But let's move on to the second scenario, which is somebody's pretty lean and but they want to add some more muscle. So let's say they want to add 5 to 7 pounds of muscle without putting on fat. Is this even possible?
Unless they're a rank beginner, a genetic freak, or using drugs, not really.
Okay. Got it. Okay.
Can it happen? Absolutely. Have I seen it happen? Yeah. Have I seen it happen in, some advanced drug-free people? Yeah. Is it common? No.
So what's the strategy to gain 5 to 7 pounds of muscle? How would you do it?
Probably going to need 6 months to a year. Protein, I'd probably go around the same. Sometimes if they can't eat enough, I may drop protein even a little bit more, which is kind of goes against what a lot of people recommend. Fat, I'm going to set it probably 60 to 80 grams-ish per day. It may go above that depending upon food choices, things of that nature. And then I'm just going to keep pushing carbohydrates up as high as I can. I'm going to keep pushing their training volume progressively over time, usually just using 4 to 7 week waves. So we'll kind of escalate volume up a little bit, kind of taper, deload a little bit, and then escalate back up again. Because we
volume,
know...
Yeah. By volume, you mean they're working out longer or harder?
Not necessarily. Just doing more work, right? So volume is the weight times the number of sets times the number of reps. So it's literally like how much work did you do in the gym?
Mm-hmm.
And since they're the person equating all of it, yeah, it gets different if you're doing a trap bar deadlift compared to a dumbbell raise and stuff like that. But if you're keeping kind of around the same scheme of lifts, if you're doing more volume over time or you're lifting heavier loads for that same amount of reps, right? So if you're doing dumbbell bench press and you only do 3 sets, I may have some people work up to 4, 5, maybe 6 sets over time. If you're using, say, 75-pound dumbbells for reps of 12, even in the future, if you can do reps of 12 for 3 sets with 80-pound dumbbells, that's a progressive overload, so you're doing a little bit more. So you know that you've provided that stimulus for your body to get stronger and to add more muscle. What the actual rate and the outcome of that is, it's like highly variable, right? You look at some studies that have what they call extreme responders. Like some people look at weights and just get bigger. Some of those studies, there's most of the people in the middle. One study Stu Phillips showed years ago, there's 2 guys up at the top who actually turned out to be brothers. And there's one poor bastard who got worse over like 12 weeks. Did all the same work and everything, and he actually got, lost muscle. It probably was about neutral. So it is quite variable, so finding, what works best with you. And then most people are going to need to be in a caloric surplus, which is usually the thing that's the hardest. Because as you start eating more and as you start training more, your metabolic rate's going to go up. So therefore, you probably need to eat even more then. So I've had people, I had one guy recently who was more of a CrossFit competitor. He was eating 530 grams of carbs in his off season per day, which most people are like, holy crap, that's insane. Yeah. But his blood glucose was good. All his health markers, his blood panels through his physician were all fine. I mean, granted, he's a younger guy and he exercises 1 to 2 hours a day and runs a gym, is pretty active. But you can get relatively high levels and still be pretty healthy. You just have to, he didn't get there overnight either. He's, not real tall and he's pulling over 500 pounds for a single easily, so
wow.
pretty strong dude.
So I know a lot of people that just go to the gym and they do the same thing over and over. So the same number of sets, same 45-pound dumbbells. What you're saying is to increase the size of your muscles or to get more muscles, you must either do more sets with the same weight or progressively start adding the weight on so you're lifting heavier loads if you keep the sets the same.
Yep. So your 3 main forms of what's called progressive overload are going to be volume. So how much work you literally did. Density. So take the volume divided by the time it took you to accomplish that. So if your 3 sets of 12 take you 21 minutes, I'm just making up numbers. If you come in and do that same work in 17 and a half minutes, cool, you did a better density. So that's another form of progressive overload. And then obviously the sheer load, the amount of weight that you lifted. You're lifting, your deadlift is 405 for a single. Now you can do 415 for a single. Cool, you got stronger. Now you can move a heavier load. Velocity and speed is kind of the last one, but for most people, that's going to be fixed anyway, so don't need to worry about it.
Okay. And follow the same protocol even for getting muscle that you outlined earlier.
Pretty similar, yeah. The biggest difference is just being in a caloric surplus. A study by Levine, which was done on not lifters at all, was done in the Mayo several years ago. Took Monday and just started overfeeding them 1,000 extra calories per day. I think they did this for 8 weeks, if I remember right. And if you look at the study, what you find is that some people only gained a couple pounds. Some people gained a massive amount of weight. What they're looking at is how much people have increased NEAT, to how much they just kind of move around subconsciously. But if you look at the actual data itself, and a fair amount of the subjects, like they gained 20, 30, sometimes even 40% of that was lean body mass.
Wow. And
these are people who were not necessarily doing a formal exercise program. Now, again, that's probably a novel stimulus to them. That's not going to continue, ad nauseum forever. And it did drop off towards the end of the study. But even just, bumping up calories in someone who's just already recreationally active can facilitate that quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they did gain some fat, of course.
Yeah. So as you're trying to follow this protocol for gaining lean muscle, are you still doing the fast once a day and fasted workouts?
Yeah. So there it really depends upon how hard is it for them to gain muscle and what is their ratio, right? So for someone like me, I'm very kind of ectomorphic, have very small wrist structure. I can gain lean body mass, but it's not very easy. Like, and if I gain at now almost even a 1-to-1 or sometimes even a 1-to-2 ratio, meaning for every pound of lean body mass I gain, I put on a pound of fat or maybe 2 pounds of fat. Most people would be like, that's horrible. I'm like, I'm pretty, if I get 1-to-1, I'm pretty stoked about that.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I take a year, say I gain 10 pounds, right? So it'd be 20 pounds overall, 10 pounds of lean mass, 10 pounds of fat. I could probably take the fat off in like 2 to 3 months, right? So to me, it's not that big of a deal.
Mm-hmm.
But everyone has their own threshold and their own ratio will vary. Some people, they may gain, 2-to-1. Some people maybe even worse than that. And a lot of it has to do with what is the threshold that they're willing to kind of walk around at.
Mm-hmm.
So if they're like, I want kind of more of the quote unquote lean gains type thing, I'm probably going to throw in a day of fasting to see if I can kind of ameliorate some of that. But I still kind of want them in that, heavier lifting 6 days of being in a caloric surplus.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if they're really worried about longevity and health and that type of thing, or they got some kind of wonky, blood parameters or weird glucose handling that makes me nervous and they're kind of high stress or they got something going on, then I think having, fasting or other things you can add, I think will be more beneficial for that type of population.
Mm-hmm.
If they're an old school eel-shaped rake that can't gain any weight, then no, you don't need to do fasting. You're just taking 2 steps backwards at that point.
Mm-hmm. Right. Which you were earlier in life, right?
Yeah, I set a clock literally for 2.5 years that I ate every 2.5 to 3 hours for literally like 2.5 years to go from 153, 156 to 185.
Wow.
And it took me another, the highest I ever got up to was like 245, but that was 12 years later. And some of that was a lot of fat too.
Yeah. That's cool. So the other question I get a lot, Mike, is this obsession with carb timing before workouts.
Yeah.
Some people say you should have simple carbs before you go work out. Some people say, well, you're going to work out for an hour, hour and a half. You should have more complex carbs so you have energy throughout the workout. And then people say as soon as you finish your workout, you should douse that protein shake with like 100 grams of dextrose or pure carbohydrates in there. What is your philosophy in carbs before and after workouts on your heavy days?
I think it can be beneficial, but a couple things to keep in mind is that your baseline levels of muscle glycogen, so the amount of carbohydrates that are stored in the muscle tissue, that's the thing that's going to dictate your performance, assuming you're well rested and all that kind of stuff, to the highest degree. You can take in a more simple form of a carbohydrate, I think, before training. I usually find that is beneficial. But if you look at the context of the whole day, if you're eating 4 to 5 times a day, by nature, it's going to be before your training, and one of them is going to be after anyway. So it's not like you need to get super neurotic about it per se. I do find that most people tend to perform a little bit better with some carbohydrates beforehand. Maybe that's just pushing insulin up. When you drive insulin up, you're pushing your body to use more carbohydrates. How much carbohydrates you can extract out of the blood is relatively limited, but we do know that it is a benefit, right? You look at endurance training studies, once you start getting over an hour, hour and a half in, more elite, humans who are pushing it pretty hard. Yeah, consuming exogenous carbohydrates as you exercise is beneficial for performance. In terms of after, again, protein timing studies, there's been about 5 that have actually been done. And in the timing studies, the only thing they changed was the timing of it. It's like the very first one was done by Paul Cribb out of Australia. It was done in recreational bodybuilders, so pretty high-level athletes. They did DEXA. They did all the cool stuff. But they had one group consume it in the morning and the evening. The other group consumed, it was a protein, carbohydrate, creatine beverage before and after exercise. In that study, they did show a pretty big difference with protein timing. Follow-up studies that were similar to that, although not exactly the same, Hoffman did one, didn't show that big of a difference. So the timing effect is pretty split. The caveat is, though, I usually tell people that have some type of protein and carbohydrate before and after training, again, within 1 to 2 hours, I think is beneficial. But for most people, when they're doing that, they're normally increasing the amount of total protein, increasing the amount of total carbs also, because for most people, that's in addition to what they were doing before, which normally is dramatically under eating if they're trying to gain lean body mass. So I've actually changed 3 variables there, not just the timing in and of itself. And that's where it gets like super confusing.
Yeah.
You don't need to slam your protein shake within 0.275 seconds of leaving the gym, or you're going to become catabolic and the anabolic gains window is going to close on you. It just doesn't work that way. I mean, muscle protein synthesis will stay elevated. Advanced lifters, probably 24 hours easily. Not advanced people, 48, maybe 72 hours even. So you've got a fair amount of time for those signaling processes are still going on. However, at some point, the longer you wait, you are missing out on the opportunity to get more out of those protein feedings and to get more protein and calories in.
Got it. Well, thank you. And you're right. It is a bit complicated. So
yeah,
if people are interested in this, they should contact you and work with you directly. A couple more questions on the gaining muscle. I'm not obsessed with it or anything, but I'm just asking.
Yeah, no, that's good. Good stuff, man.
What about, so when you're in the 3 days that you're working out hard, what would you recommend? Is that an isolated muscle by muscle exercise, or we're doing full body in those 3 days? And how long does the workout last?
Yeah. Most of my clients, if they're, recreational people, they've been around a gym a fair amount, they know exercises. I actually start them out on trying to spread as much stress out as I can over those 3 to potentially 4 days. So it'll look weird to most people, because most people, when I get them, especially guys, look at it and it looks exactly like something from the 90s out of Flex magazine, right? Because everybody knows that Monday's International Chest Day, and you need 7 chest exercises to annihilate every single fiber in your chest, and then no one really does leg day. I think shoulder day is Wednesday or something, and a very high amount of just isolation type exercises. And I think those can be useful, but to me, those are in addition to, I like some just basic old school, like heavier loading. So a very simple one that's easy to explain would be, if you still want to bench press on Monday, that's cool. Do bench press on Monday, maybe one other exercise there, but I'll probably throw shoulders and back in at the same time. Wednesday then maybe is a lower-ish body day, but you'll probably start doing some form of a squat. Friday, probably start with some form of a deadlift and then an overhead press. And even then, I'll even kind of mix stuff up even more. Because if it's a natural lifter, most people can't get enough out of the muscle per se to allow it 7 full days to completely recover. They're going to start detraining along that way. And most people aren't advanced enough that if you look at the quality of the stimulus that they're getting by like exercise 4, it's just really not that good. So I'll spread it out over the course of a week, right? So Monday, maybe dumbbell bench press, and then maybe dumbbell fly, right, for chest stuff. Wednesday, you may do some form of dips, and then Friday, you may be doing just a couple sets of push-ups or something too. So again, I'm not really fatiguing. I'm not applying a ton of stress per se, but I'm spreading that out a little bit over the course of the week. So I tend to kind of mix everything a little bit together, and I find that usually works pretty good to start. And then as people progress, I have some guys who I do what I call the dude bra workouts, where it's just, one day is just chest and back, but I find that that's usually much more of an advanced type thing. Got
it. I want to ask you a lot of nutrient questions, but what do you think of pre-workouts and BCAAs?
BCAAs are pretty worthless if your protein's in check. I mean, that's pretty simple. Some rare circumstances, it could be useful. If you're a vegan, your protein is low, it's incomplete. BCAAs can be helpful with that because it bumps up the total amount of leucine to cross the leucine threshold, blah, blah, blah. Pre-workouts, man, just have some coffee or caffeine if you want. There's maybe a few other things that may be helpful, but that's by far the biggest one. If people like pre-workouts, I don't have anything against them per se, but most of the other ingredients in there probably aren't super helpful. Creatine can be helpful, but you probably don't want to take it before working out. You can, but absorption is going to be less. So actually post-lifting is going to be a little bit better.
Okay. Got it. All right. Let's move on to the next scenario, and we're running up on time, so I want to be respectful. Let's say that in the odd chance you gain the muscle that you want, you lose the fat that you want, and now you're at the perfect weight and body composition and shape.
Nice.
What you want, right? Doesn't really ever happen, but let's say you're there.
Cool.
How do you keep the perfect body? What do you do to maintain what you have?
Whatever you did to get there.
No,
I know it sounds like overly simplistic, but
yeah. What would be different than trying to lose 5 pounds of fat or trying to gain 7 pounds of muscle?
Yeah. So the first question I'm going to ask that person then is, do you like what you're doing? Like, because they may be someone, and I've had this happen in the past, that are like, dude, I got exactly where I want to be. This is awesome. I'm like, cool. Do you like training now? Like, no, I freaking hate training. I'm like, okay. So if you don't enjoy the process, then now I'm going to try to pull back as far as I can and still have you maintain of where you're at. Because if you only care about maintaining, you can actually, if you wanted to, get by with not a lot of work. Like the amount of work it takes to maintain something is a fraction of what it takes to gain it. Now, the caveat is, as you get older, all that stuff, especially aging, things like that can work against you. So you could make the argument of kind of always trying to creep up is probably going to be beneficial. But if someone just says, screw it, I got a year, I just want to, keep everything where I'm at, I'm more interested, do they enjoy doing the process? Do they like training? If they like training, I'm probably going to try to convince them that, to stay neutral over the course of your life, you're probably going to want to try to keep pushing that up a little bit. But then you're weighing, do they enjoy it? How much time do they have? Things of that nature. And then I also ask them, what are kind of your health parameters look like? Especially if you're a guy, like, do you even know your doctor's name? Like, have you ever talked to him? Like, when's the last time you got blood work? Very, very kind of basic stuff just to make sure that's all good. If that's all cool, then, for most people, then it's like, okay, how much can I do and get away with it? Right? They may be like, dude, to get to this point, I gave up, going out with the boys on Friday night and having 3 beers. Cool. Go out on Friday night, have 3 beers, maybe 2, whatever, and see if you're able to maintain where you're at. I think people, if they get to where they want to go in an intelligent manner, I think they'd be pretty shocked at how much they can actually get away with and not have everything go completely sideways either.
Okay, great. Now, a few more questions.
Yeah.
As we get older, Mike, this, it gets harder to heal from injuries as when we were in our teens.
Yeah.
For example. Do you typically recommend something other than the military press or, the shoulder press reps, which is like free weight and it's up in the air and you're kind of trying to balance. And if you mess up, you tear your rotator cuff or you do something that will take you out for a while. And you may honestly never completely heal from that. So as we get older, do you change up anything or are you more careful with how people work out? What would you do?
To me, it's always a risk reward, right? And again, not to default to psychology, but do you like doing that? Like I was just watching the history show where they have the 4 strongmen on there from World's Strongest Man going around to doing all these other historic, events. And Nick Best is on there, who's like 50 years old, and if you look at it, and I don't know his health background at all, but I can imagine from being a competitor at a pretty high level for many years, probably has some, bumps and bruises and nicks and stuff going on. But just by watching one episode, you can tell that that's what he just loves doing, right? So for him to kind of give that up is probably going to be pretty hard. If you have someone else who's like, dude, I don't even care how much I bench press with a straight bar anymore. Yeah, maybe doing some other types of, heavy dumbbells, things like that may be beneficial. It also depends on how long they've been lifting. What does their form look like? How well is their kind of underlying, activation, things of that nature? And you can just assess that on yourself pretty simply by like, how much pain do you have walking around?
Mm-hmm.
If like every day you get up and your right shoulder hurts, I'd be like, well, don't keep, doing things with your right shoulder that hurt. But if you don't have any pain, everything feels good, you kind of enjoy exercise, then it kind of, I would just default to what your goals are. And of course, there is always risk reward. Like I'm a screwball. Like I want to lift Benny stones that are 734 pounds, which is a off axis screwball looking lift. Is from a pure health standpoint, is that probably the best thing I should do? Not really, but I'm giving myself 15 years in order to be able to do it. So I'm not in a huge hurry. I'm not going to push myself beyond where I feel like I should be. But that's something I want to do. So I'm willing to take a little bit more risk in that area.
Okay, fair. Now, when we talk about carbs, Mike, there's so many options. You can walk into a grocery store or supermarket and the middle aisles are full
Yeah.
packaged crap that we can eat as carbs, or we can do other more healthy carbs. What type of carbs do you recommend to your clients?
I mean, I usually like, focusing on more real food stuff that doesn't come in a wrapper. I mean, having that as the basis of most of your carbs, I think is going to be beneficial. You're also going to get a lot of the fiber. You're going to get a lot of the micronutrients and phytochemicals and all the other beneficial things that come with it. Normally, your sense of satiety, especially if you're trying to cut calories, is going to be a lot higher too. But, on the flip side, if someone is like really trying to gain lean body mass and you look at it and they're eating like, mostly healthy foods, then having a few donuts and stuff like that, I don't think is going to be the end of it all either. One thing I'll do is I call it the Pop-Tart test. Can you eat 2 Pop-Tarts for breakfast and nothing else? And can your glycemic numbers stay in range and you don't feel like you're going to pass out and crawl under your table for 2 hours? Right. I'm not saying people should eat Pop-Tarts every day for breakfast, but my bias is you should be able to handle like what is a extremely high amount of highly processed carbohydrates on something that's probably a frosting that's more like a resin than something else, and see how you can handle it. Because to me, that's actually a marker of resilience.
Yep.
That doesn't mean that that's going to be your new breakfast every day either.
Yeah. So, okay.
People always want to go one extreme or the other.
Yeah. Mike, what are your top 3 anti-aging hacks or tips for the audience?
Ooh, that's a good one. Number 1, I got this from Dr. Brian Walsh, is just, and there's good research to support this, having a sense of purpose. I mean, like you hear all those stories of like, guy who, George Burns, who drank all the time, smoked cigars, lives to, almost 100. But the guy knew what he was doing in his life too. I'm not saying all those things are extreme benefits, but I think just having a purpose can override a lot of the stuff that we get hyper-focused, neurotic about. And related to that, I would say just, doing things that you love as often as you can. A lot of people do, I think, too much of, well, I'm just going to do this when I retire or in 5 years or 10 years or whatever. And then number 3, the top 3 things for longevity are going to be lower body mass and strength, grip strength, and cardiovascular training. I think if people have some hybrid of that in their training that's, kind of pretty evenly distributed, I think they're going to be, doing pretty good in that area.
And so can you expand a little bit on lower body mass strength and grip strength?
Yeah. So some cool studies from Scandinavian countries that, and if you think about it, it makes sense, right? So the older people get, the risk of dying from a hip fracture goes up astronomically. Right. So the stronger you are, especially those fast twitch fibers, like no one just kind of tips over like a weeble, right? It's a very fast thing. And if you watch people catch themselves from a fall, it's a reflex. And a lot of times the reflex may still be present, but there's nothing there to support them. So having lower body strength probably reduces the risk of falls. Having more muscle mass could also be maybe just a protectant. If you fall on your hip and there's not much muscle there, not as much to, cushion the impact and things of that nature. Grip strength is probably more of a correlate, right? So I've never met anyone who is very, very strong, who has a weak grip. I've kind of met a few freaks that are a little bit inverted, but it's like rare that you'd ever meet a super strong person and their grip is just horrible, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty rare. So I think grip strength is probably a pretty good predictor of just overall strength. And we do know that that definitely goes down as we age, but we also know overall strength goes down as we age too.
Yeah, agreed on both of those. I do, so between doing the leg workouts once a week, I also do between sets, I'll stand on one leg and kind of throw my other leg around, front,
Oh,
back,
nice.
left,
Yeah, yeah.
right, to kind of like force myself to acclimate to where the weight's going and
Yeah.
so build balance better that way. And then the other thing I do is I hold a kettlebell upside down. So
Yeah. Bottoms up press.
bottoms up press and then
Yeah.
walk, try to get as heavy as I can and then try to walk 10 steps while holding that in
Yeah.
effect. You got to be
That's
careful
a
because
great,
your wrist can like
yep. It's a
roll
great
around.
grip and wrist, right? Because a lot of people have a very weak wrist, which will make their grip weak, right? And they do a bottoms up press and it's like,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
yeah, that's a
exactly.
good one.
What type of clients do you take on, Mike, and how do they work with you? How do you work with them?
Yeah, so oddly enough, most of my clients are actually female, even though all my writing and newsletter stuff is actually geared toward guys. Which it's just a weird thing.
Must
I
be
mean,
your good looks, man.
yeah, that must be it. All the gray hair I got going on.
I'm sure Jody's not happy about that.
Yeah. But yeah, so I do some online work for probably like 90% of the people. I do all their training, lifestyle, nutrition, monitoring stress via heart rate variability, pretty much everything. If they need, blood work, I always just send them to their physician, look at some basic stuff if it's just health parameters, things of that nature. Yeah, and if they need more info, it's just on the website, which is just miketnelson.com. Yeah, so probably the best way. I mean, I don't have a whole lot of open slots, to be honest, but I have a few open every once in a while, and it's definitely more on the expensive end. But even if it's for a short period of time, I think, because I'm very big on the educational process. Like I want people to understand why we're doing the specific things. So when they're done, they're like, oh, okay, I got to the goal I wanted to get to, and I know how I got here and what I need to do to keep it, instead of just, shut up and just do the training. It's like, yeah, you got to do the work, but I want people to actually be involved in the process and to understand it too.
So it's comprehensive. People understand what type of training they're going to do, what nutrition they're going to have, what their blood levels might look like, how their heart rate might respond to training. It's everything.
Yeah, and the assessment's about a week-long assessment where you just kind of beat the crap out of them. And, if they really want cardiovascular, we'll run them through everything from high-end power, like completely map the, full spectrum, to lactate work, to whatever. Again, depending on what they need. Some people don't need that. They just need a marker of high and low intensity, and they're good to go. So, but yeah, it just depends on what's going on.
Okay, folks, if you want to work with Mike, go to miketnelson.com. And Mike, I'll include a link to that.
Cool, thank you.
Show notes for this episode as well. Mike, thank you so much for coming on the Anti-Aging Hacks podcast. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And, people want more information. I do a newsletter, and that's just free. And they can just go to my website, miketnelson.com. It's usually some type of little banner or thing at the top there. Or if they want, they can just text 44222 and then just text the word keto ebook. One of the main questions I get is, well, should I do a ketogenic diet? So I actually wrote a little ebook and put a flow chart in there. So I'll just text keto ebook to 44222.
Is that one word, keto ebook?
Yep, all one word.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
44222. Okay.
Perfect.
Great. Thanks, Mike.